Hi, everyone. This is the second video lecture in our cell series. And in the last video, we talked about characteristics that are found in every single kind of cell. And in this video, we're going to get into this kind of cell versus that kind of cell, and the very most basic differentiation that we can make between the two most different kinds of cells. So these are the furthest away from each other in terms of similarity. The most basic divide you can have is between prokaryotic cells and eukaryotic cells. Prokaryotic cells are bacterial cells. Also, archaea are prokaryotes, and they came about much earlier in evolutionary history. So they're a lot older. They're the oldest kind of cell, and they came around billions and billions of years before eukaryotic cells did. Prokaryotic cells are smaller, so they're also much more simple structurally. So they don't have a lot of compartments. They have an inside and an outside, but no separate subcompartments within the cell. They have one piece of DNA that's circular. That's this red piece right here is this bacterial cell's DNA. It's kind of hard to see because it's tangled up like tangled yarn, but if you untangled it, it would just be one circular piece of DNA. And remember that that DNA is instructions for making the proteins. And then one thing that I do want to point out here is that just because they're simple doesn't mean that they're not sophisticated in their own way. So there's still a lot of really complex chemistry that's happening within these prokaryotes, and they're able to live in really extreme environments, like really deep underground and in really hot areas. Some can survive without oxygen, so they can live in a lot of places that eukaryotes would never be able to. Okay, and then eukaryotes came about way, way later in time, evolutionarily speaking. So they're going to be younger in terms of evolution. And they're also going to be a little more familiar to us because any sort of animal like we are, plants, fungi, protists, those are all eukaryotes. Eukaryotes are much larger and structurally they're more complex. So they're going to have a little bit more going on in terms of pockets and little compartments doing specific things. So eukaryotes possess what we call organelles, which are cellular parts that are doing specific jobs. And our DNA in a eukaryotic cell is going to be multiple pieces of linear DNA rather than a single circular piece. Okay, so this next slide is going to be about plant cells versus animal cells. And I just want to take a moment and point out that both of these, plant cells and animal cells, they're both eukaryotic. So we're sort of zooming in on the eukaryotic side here. Okay, so there are some big picture differences between the structures that an animal cell has that a plant cell doesn't, and structures that a plant cell has that an animal cell doesn't. And I'm just going to gloss over a little bit this idea of lysosomes and centrioles. Lysosomes we'll talk about more in another slide, but they have to do with recycling in a cell. Centrioles have to do with moving the DNA during cell division. But what we really want to focus on here is the structures that plant cells have that animal cells don't. And one of these things is a cell wall. And I said earlier that all cells have a cell membrane that separates the inside of the cell from the outside. And plant cells have a cell membrane, but they also have a cell wall. And the cell wall is going to be important for giving the cell some structure and some support. So the walls are really rigid, and it helps the plant cell sort of stand up and be supported. Another thing that plant cells have is this thing called a central vacuole, and that's shown right here. It should really be a lot bigger, but the central vacuole is filled with stuff, usually water. And so if you're thinking about the cell um, walls, like here, the actual vacuole is in the middle, and when it is filled with water, it pushes against the cell wall, and it sort of makes it nice and rigid and plump. So that's why if you don't water a plant, it starts to get wilted because the central vacuole um, doesn't have enough water. And then when you water the plant, the vacuole fills up and it pushes against the cell wall and it lets the plant cell stand up straight. And then finally, chloroplasts. And those are the photosynthetic organelles that lets the plant do the process of photosynthesis. So plants that are capable of doing photosynthesis and also some photosynthetic protists will have chloroplasts, and that enables them to capture the sun energy and do this process of photosynthesis. Okay, so this next slide is just a little sneak peek of what you'll see in lab when we look at these structures in person. This image on the right is a water pond plant called Elodia, and you can't really see all of the structures, but you can see the chloroplast. So each of these little green blobs here is an individual chloroplast, and you can also see that the structure is much more rectangular, and that's because of the cell wall that so plants are going to have the cell wall, and it's going to give them a lot more rigid of a structure. And then on the other side, we have an animal cell, and these are cheek cells that are stained with a certain dye. So you can actually see the nucleus in the middle. That's this dark spot here. And in comparison to the plant cell, you can see that the outside of the animal cell is a lot more uh, less defined. And that's because animal cells don't have a cell wall, they just have that flexible cell membrane. Okay, so I don't want to get into too much nitty-gritty detail about these organelles, but essentially, organelles are specific structures inside of cells, and the inside of eukaryotic cells, since eukaryotic cells are the only kind of cell that has organelles, and prokaryotic cells do not. But these structures are going to be performing specific jobs. They are surrounded by a membrane, and the point of these organelles is that they allow the different functions of a cell to be divided up into specific compartments. So, one way to think about this is the same way that your house is probably divided into different rooms, and these rooms allow you to carry out specific tasks more easily. So, let's say the kitchen. In the kitchen, you probably have like all your pots and pans and knives and cutting boards. The food is probably in the kitchen, probably a refrigerator, and that's so that when you're preparing food, everything you need to do that task is right there in the kitchen. In your bedroom, you have your bed, and you probably have your pajamas in your bedroom. So the task of sleeping, everything you need to do to sleep is going to be in your bedroom. And in the same way, cells have specific jobs that they need to do. So, certain energy production jobs that are all going to happen in the mitochondria, certain jobs like recycling, where things are getting digested and broken down, and all of that's happening in the lysosome. So, the cell, since the eukaryotic cells are so much bigger, it's easier for them to have all of the parts that they need to do certain jobs right in one compartment or right in one organelle. Um, Okay, so these four organelles that are on this side are all involved with making things and distributing them. So it's sort of like um, we said proteins are sort of this important thing within a cell, and all of these structures, all of these parts are involved with how proteins get made and packaged and shipped off. So we're going to start right here on this. So the nucleus is going to be our starting point, and the nucleus is the control center. And we said that the DNA is the instruction booklet for how to make different kinds of proteins. And the DNA is housed inside of the nucleus. So you can see the nucleus right here, and it's protecting the DNA, kind of keeping it safe. So starting with the nucleus, which holds the DNA, and right outside of the nucleus, we have what's called the endoplasmic reticulum. And the endoplasmic reticulum, or the ER, because that's a little bit of a mouthful, can be either rough or smooth. And I'm going to talk about the smooth ER first. So the smooth ER is important for making lipids or fats. So lipids are made in the smooth ER. You can't really see smooth ER here, but what you do see is rough ER. And the rough ER is rough because it's studded with all of these little dots, these red dots, and these dots are all ribosomes. And we've already said that ribosomes are important because they are the workbenches we use to build proteins. And so the rough ER has ribosomes, and those ribosomes are making proteins. So the rough ER also makes proteins. Um, and then from here, we're going to go to the Golgi, and you can think of the Golgi apparatus as sort of like a shipping warehouse. So proteins and other molecules come to the Golgi, and they can be modified. So stuff can be stuck onto the molecules, they can be packaged up into little vesicles here, which are basically just little shipping containers. Um, Proteins and other molecules that come out of the Golgi can either go somewhere else in the cell, so maybe they're going to a chloroplast because that's where they need to go, or they can also be shipped out of the cell entirely. So it might be exported from the cell, and that's all happening at the Golgi. Um, Whether ribosomes are an organelle is questionable. I don't think they're an organelle, but some books say they are, so we're just gonna go with it. Um, okay, so we also have organelles that are involved with energy transformation. So in every eukaryotic cell, plants and animals, we have organelles called mitochondria. And the mitochondria's job is to break down sugar and give us energy that the cell can use, which is going to be in the form of ATP. And we're going to learn more about cellular respiration in detail later, but essentially that's what the mitochondria is doing. It's giving us a form of energy that the cell can actually use. Mitochondrion is the singular form of the plural mitochondria. And then the other major organelle involved with energy transformation is the chloroplast. And again, the chloroplast is going to be only found in photosynthetic organisms like plants, but that's where all of the photosynthetic reactions are taking place for the cell. It's also where the plant is going to harvest the sunlight and turn it into sugar, along with water and carbon dioxide. Um, okay, so these are some other basic organelles. Um, of note. So I already mentioned this, but the inside of a central, this idea of a central vacuole, they're only found in plants, and it's where water is going to be held. And a fun fact is that for flowers that are colored, a lot of the pigment molecules that make the flower the color that it is also stored in a central vacuole. So it can be really specialized as well. So things like potatoes that have a lot of starch, central vacuoles can be modified to hold that starch instead. But for the most part, they hold water, and like I said, they give the plant that rigidity that it needs because the central vacuole is able to push up against the cell wall. But it's basically another sort of sac, which most of these organelles that hold stuff are like. And then lysosomes are a digestion and a recycling center. So lysosomes hold a bunch of enzymes, they hold a bunch of molecules that are really good at breaking stuff down, chewing things up. And this can be used to help defend the cell. So if something gets in, like a virus that shouldn't be there, sometimes lysosomes are able to break those things down. It's also good for recycling old and damaged cell parts. Okay, then this is the last slide. I know this is kind of a long video at this point. So this last thing are there cell structures that are important for support and movement. And this first one that they're going to talk about is a cytoskeleton. And cyto is a prefix that means cell. So this really means like cellular skeleton. And there are a bunch of different kinds of fibers, essentially. So, really big microtubule fibers, actin, basically a bunch of different fibers that span the whole cell. And they're sort of like an internal structural system that sort of gives the cell support and structure. But it's also really dynamic. So, when the cell is going to move, the cytoskeleton itself moves, and that's how the cell moves. The last thing that the cytoskeleton does is that it's really important for transport. So there are parts of the cytoskeleton that act almost like railways, where transport can be moved across these different cytoskeleton components. And then finally, we have two structures that are important for movement, and those are cilia and flagella. Cilia are tiny, more sort of like hair-like projections on the outside of a cell, and some smaller one-celled organisms use this to move. So it kind of lets them sort of float around in water. But in our bodies, we have cells that are lined with cilia as well. So your lungs and your airway and your respiratory tract, that's that's the word. A lot of those cells are lined with cilia, and they're constantly beating to move mucus towards your mouth and nose, so that all the dust you might be inhaling um, doesn't get into your lungs. And then flagella, finally, are these much larger projections from the outside of a cell. So a lot of bacteria will have flagella to help them swim. For human cells, the only cell type that has flagella are sperm. So that's probably like the most classic example of a swimming cell for humans. Um, and yes, I think that's the last bit. So again, sorry for this being a little bit long, and I'll see you all soon.